Hello, you wonderful people. If you haven't already, make sure you sign up to our Patreon account. The link will be in the description of this podcast, but you can also go to patreon.com/Earthly Delights Pod. For as little as €4 a month, you can help us out and become part of our little community. You'll get early access to all of the pods, and you'll also get a monthly newsletter from myself and Jim. So basically, two monthly newsletters where we'll talk about stuff that's going on in our own personal lives and what we've been thinking about/inspired about. We also are asking you guys to get involved with the podcast. So you can send in questions for our upcoming guests, or you can suggest to us people or topics you would like us to interview and explore further. We love you. We hope that you love us, and hopefully, just by giving us as little as €4 a month, that's basically, it's not even a pint in London, that you can help us become an even better podcast. Thank you all.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Earthly Delights. Jill Vialet is the guest this week. Now, Jill is the founder of Playworks, the leading American nonprofit leveraging the power of safe, fun, and healthy play at school every day. Playworks creates a place for every kid on the playground to feel included, to be active, and build valuable social and emotional skills. Playworks partners with schools, districts, and after school programs to provide a service or a mix of services, including on site coaches, professional training for school staff who support recess, and consultative partnerships. In this conversation, Jill informs us of the significance of play for children, adolescents, and adults, and its relationship to a more engaged, communicative society. I asked Jill on, as I've been thinking a lot lately about the lack of play and fun in our jam packed lives, and Jill speaks with a wise nuance and with a passion that is truly uplifting. I hope this podcast might encourage you to look at the less serious aspects of life, such as play, with more reverence and understand and emphasize the crucial nature of it to our personal and collective well being. If you would like to learn more about Jill or the work of Playworks, please see the link below. Thanks a million, friends. All the best. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the podcast. This week, our guest is Jill Vialet. Thanks a million for coming on.
My pleasure.
First and foremost, what's the crack? How are you keeping?
I'm good. That's so Irish of you. I'm really so pleased by that. I'm a little worried about the Ukraine. I'm, focused on like the mundane and the big at once, and but it's so emblematic of this moment, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
sorry, didn't mean to bring you
No.
down right away at the beginning.
No, it's a difficult place to be for sure.
Yeah.
Kind of, and like, this is what I want to talk about as we get on to your work. But the kind of idea that it's so easy to feel somewhat powerless when you're kind of hearing about these big overarching issues, right? And
Yeah.
you want to do something, but you don't know what you could do, and I think it's tough for us.
It is. It's tough. And then I also think it's super instructive, right? I have found so much solace in sort of applying the lessons of play to navigating this moment. And like, I just feel much better if I do something, no matter how small or like how seemingly inconsequential. Um, it feels like you got two choices. You can either spin out and worry, or you can lean in. And I'm a believer in the power of small acts, done by lots and
Yeah,
lots and lots and lots of people, and just the
yeah.
fundamental value of caring.
I'm with you there. I guess I wanted to ask as well. Do you think sometimes we don't we believe that actions don't really matter? We think, oh, what's the point
Oh,
of even trying?
yeah, for sure, right? Like
Yeah,
I think especially in the United States, I've been doing lots of work around play, but have been in this sort of the last two really pivoted to thinking more about sort of engaging with democracy in a playful way, and you hear it all the time, like my vote doesn't matter, but even though, and it feels maybe like a weird parallel, but you see that like with kids on the playground. Like that's one of the first places we learn where like what you do and how you show up matter profoundly, and they it's the
Yeah.
difference between a good experience and a bad experience. And I just I people I think are sometimes a little uncomfortable when I make comparisons between recess and democracy, but I'm like, suck it up, buttercup. Like that's just like we are humans and doing our best.
Yeah, this is definitely what one of the aims for this podcast is for someone listening who would be quite interested in politics and democracy and community engagement. Here, like we don't have time to be talking about play, and I think your book does a very great job of showing that really all of the and the skills that we need for an effective community and communication with people that we don't know so well and our ability to lead come from the playground.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I
So
definitely,
before,
yeah.
sorry,
Go for it. Well, I was
sorry,
just going to
before
try.
we
I
get
was
into
just.
that, sorry.
You go. We could rock paper scissors to see who goes, but I think you should go since it's your podcast.
Okay. So I was going to say before we get into that, can I ask for listeners unfamiliar with you or your work, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you became so involved in play?
Sure. So I am I guess I would describe myself as a serial social entrepreneur. I started my first nonprofit when I was 23 years old, which was a children's art museum, which is happily still alive and well in Oakland, California. And to my great delight, is led by a woman who, when I was 24, she was my 14-year-old intern. And I love that. Like, that just makes me super happy that she's now the executive director. Um, Mocha is great. And then I ran Mocha for about 9 years. And then I was having this sort of series of experiences where I was just noticing that play in schools didn't feel the way I recalled play feeling. Like I was a kid who like super hyperactive, and undoubtedly if I was a kid today, I would have been diagnosed with ADD and all these, I would have been medicated heavily. Instead, my parents just like ran me like I was a border collie. And so I lived for recess. And so being out in schools and seeing, and I have a fairly high tolerance for chaos, but I would say there's good chaos and there's bad chaos. And what I was seeing was sort of a chaos that didn't feel healthy and joyful. And so I kept having that experience, and then it uh, sort of reached a breaking point with a principal who took me aside and asked if I might sort of do what I had done with art in her school, but with play and recess. And so that led to me founding this nonprofit called Playworks, which has grown um, throughout the United States, and in fact has a little bit of presence in Ireland, there in Dublin and Galway, uh, and then and then more recently, while running Playworks, had this experience where principals would quietly beg me to lend the Playworks coach to be a substitute teacher, or some parts call it supply teacher, the sort of a stand-in teacher when a teacher is absent. So it started another nonprofit called Substantial Classrooms. So with the pandemic, I laid myself off at Playworks, and I've been sort of pivoting, engaging more with politics. I've written a couple of books, um, and I'm teaching at both UC Berkeley at the business school and at Stanford at the design school.
Busy woman.
That's what I do. Well, yes, busy. And then I like to run and play outside, and I have a blended family with 5 kids between the ages of 18 and 26.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I definitely want to ask you how you go about playing, but
Yeah.
the the first follow up question I think for listeners would be what why do you think play is so important, or what were the first steps or signs that you saw that play really does have greater significance than very often people give it?
Yeah. I think when I was starting Playworks, the insight that drove me the most was one of empathy. That, like, as a kid, I sometimes felt like kind of nerdy and other, and like, and the one time where I always felt like I fit in was when we were playing, like, right, this sort of wordlessly communicating in this very profound way with people, from just school ground playground games to like sport, like from I played basketball and soccer in high school, and ended up playing rugby in college and then after. And there is this way of communicating with other humans, um, that feels to me just profoundly true and real, and often unspoken, but like, there is a way that connection happens, I think, through play that builds trust and rapport, that I think helps humans thrive. So when I was thinking about schools and how recess felt like this sort of unsafe chaos that I sort of was describing, I thought that would have been so hard for me, that I needed those moments of connection with others to be healthy and good. And so I wanted to make sure that kids had what I had gotten, the best parts of sort of my experience of being a kid. But then I think also, as a grown up, and especially as a woman of a certain age leading organizations, like, I was pretty clear that a huge part of what made me effective as an executive was my understanding of when to shine as a star, but when to focus on the assist and to really celebrate and promote the success of others, and that the power of collaboration, and just understanding, um, just how to sort of navigate our messy interdependence. And so I think it's been a very, like, I'm not an academic, like, that's not where this my understanding of play came from. I have I am super nerdy, and so having this intuitive sort of interest in it and belief and personal experience, I've then done a lot of reading to try and understand what academics think about why this is true, with all of which I take with a grain of salt. But I do. It has been largely predicated on personal experience.
Jill, you talk about the differences that you saw from when when you were a kid and when you were growing up, and how hyperactive you were, and that you needed that was what you looked forward to the most was playtime, as we call it in the UK, or recess. Um, but for some of our listeners, myself maybe included, who are quite young, and all we know is kind of what we've experienced in the last 10 years at school, and we don't know how our parents kind of saw playtime or recess. What are the key differences that you would see, that you could say this is how it was in my time, and this is what
Yeah,
I'm seeing now, which is what I don't really like, or which I think could
yeah,
potentially be dangerous?
yeah. I think, I mean, I joke a little. We live in this world right now where and I think it's important to say, first off, the experiences are not monolithic, right? I think in the United States, what I'm most familiar with, right, there's a big difference across class and how things roll out, and economics have a huge impact on who has access to get to play. I will say that when I was a kid, growing up in a middle class family in Washington D.C., by today's standards, I was raised by wolves. Like, I was allowed to. We ran outside unsupervised in these mixed age groups of kids,
Hmm.
and I remember, like, there was like Amy Hanks, and like, I remember these kids. Like, I remember both their names, their first and last names, and you know, and anyway, uh, and we would do stuff that was pretty sketchy. Like, we would like climb into the sewers, and we played like foxes and hounds, and kick the can and games, until dusk, and then we would disperse. Um, and anyway, having that kind of mixed age interaction, really unsupervised, where kids were navigating the rules and the older kids were passing down an understanding about how you resolve conflicts and how you even out teams and self handicap, all that kind of pretty like nuanced human interaction. That then those were transferable skills we brought with us to school. And so at recess, break time, um, we were out there, and we had a fairly under, good understanding about how to navigate a structure that afforded us chances to play together. what we see now is that kids just have fewer and fewer opportunities to play outside of school in these unstructured, unsupervised kind of ways. And it then plays out on at school at school at break time in the school. So they don't come with the same understanding about like, oh, Jill and Jim, you got rock paper scissors to decide who goes first, or Jim, you and Seb switch sides to even the teams out. Like that doesn't happen without grown-ups kind of sort of suggesting it in ways. And what's funny in America, and I think this is true internationally, but we're in this like profound moment of political polarization where even play has become sort of a proxy issue for political divides. And so I have been called a recess fascist by the left, where they think that we should have completely unadulterated, no, there should be no, grown-up involvement whatsoever. And I've been called a vanguard of the Obama nanny state by the right, where they think children should just be left to like throw rocks at each other. I mean, like it's crazy town. And the vast majority of humans fall somewhere in the middle and think, you know what, no. We want to create enough structure, but always with an eye towards turning it over to the kids so that they can own it and be drivers of their own playtime, which hopefully then leads to them being drivers of their own education.
I have two questions. The first one would be, I think maybe Jim and I, maybe the last generation where like we would just go out the house and you'd have, I'm not sure if the phrase exists in America, but you would just knock on, where
Yeah,
you would just like knock onto your friend's house and be like, "Is Jim out allowed to play out?" And you just
yeah,
like, hopefully
right.
he's done his homework or whatever, and his parents let
Yeah,
him play.
yeah,
And then, like you said, we all know that we could play till a certain hour or whatever, and then we'd all come back home. But even my sister, who is 6 years younger than me, so she's now 20, but she didn't have that experience when she grew up. So there's only 6 years difference in us when we were both growing up, obviously. But she didn't. She was much more, would play inside with her own, whatever, her own dolls or
play
whatever it
dates.
was.
With the
Yeah,
play date
play
is one of the
dates,
most
yeah, that
god
type of
awful
stuff.
things ever. Like,
Exactly. And so what I wonder is, I'm sure there'll be people listen to this nostalgically, like thinking back about, reminiscing on what it was like back then, when all the kids on the estate would play out. But now that that's not the case, is there any way that that can be reintroduced? I mean, I don't know how
yeah.
do you save that, or how do you bring it back from the dead?
Well, so two things. One, I'm always like, so first off, anytime nostalgia starts to creep in, I'm always like, ooh, check that. Because like
Yeah,
nostalgia is usually a little problematic, right? So
yeah.
I think there's also like, I don't know if you like Margaret Atwood, the novelist, and she has this sort of very chilling novel, Cat's Eye, in which she describes more of the era that I was a kid in. And kids could be cruel. Like, I don't mean to
Mm,
like gloss over like this. It was not all like unicorns and marshmallows. It wasn't like totally joy. So I don't want to like over glamorize, like it was not without its problems. That said, um, there are some really cool initiatives. There's Lenore Skenazy is in the US, and she's this fascinating person who came to some fame because she allowed her 9-year old son to ride the New York subway unsupervised, and it was brought to the authorities, the attention of the authorities, and like their child protective services was called in for like this act of neglect. And people were like, oh yeah, that's terrible. Or people were like, are you kidding? Like a 9-year-old can totally ride the subway. That's like, she's taught him how to do it. This is not and anyway, it was an interesting moment. She started something along with this really amazing play philosopher academic Peter Gray called the Let Grow Project. And the Let Grow Project is kind of a fascinating thing to check out. They do a bunch of different activities, but one thing they do is this activity where it's usually run by a classroom teacher, and the kids in the class, second, third graders, come up with an idea for an activity that they want to do that they're not usually allowed to do. Like, could be ride their bike to the store or cook using open flame and knives. Imagine some kind of activity that there's some inherent risk, or clean the skylights on the roof. I don't know, whatever it is that they want to do, intrinsically motivated to do, but that their gut is that their parents would have, their family, whoever's in charge of caring for them, would have some reservations about. They then propose this activity to the adult, the responsible adult, the parent or the guardian, and then there's a negotiation process, and um, and it's very thoughtful, and then ultimately they do it and they report back on how it went and what happens. And it's interesting. One of the things Lenore said to me that I just found fascinating was that often the kids totally take it in stride, and it's sort of a not anticlimactic, but it's cool thing they do. It is the parents who experience it as the most like, oh wow, I was so freaked out, and like this was such a big deal for me, and it was such a good reminder that my child has so much capacity that I don't necessarily allow them to exercise. And I would just say that, like, I try to write about this in my book about, I think one of the great sort of paradoxes of play, right, is that um, the way that we learn to mitigate and navigate and manage risk is by taking risks. So you can't just do the metaphorical equivalent of putting foam on all the corners of everything. You have to let kids bump their heads. Like that's how we learn. And so, and it's hard for schools, right? We live in litigious societies. Like that's not how it works. Like they're supposed to be managing the hell out of risks, right? And so it's a really intense tension.
Mm, yeah. I, the other question that I had was when you were talking about, for example, um imagine if you guys were at school, you would know how to, let's level up the teams because this isn't fair, or so on and so forth. And there might be some people listening and going, what's the big deal if the kids don't know how to do that because they haven't learned it in the backyard, out in the open, when there's no one monitoring them? So what, they'll learn it sooner or eventually, or even if they don't learn it, really, what's the big deal? And I just wanted to know, in your research, in your opinion, like what are the ramifications of kind of not learning that behavior, not understanding things that you took for granted as a child that you just learn, in terms of like in the adult world when they grow up? Or how does that become something that we go, oh crap, that was really not something good, and
Yeah,
kind of learn the hard way they would
yeah,
actually be way better now? Or
yeah. Well, and that is exactly the work of Playworks, right? That, and for me, um, I joke a lot, like, um, I've now over my career employed lots and lots of people. I've never fired anyone because they weren't good at taking a standardized test in some ways. I have fired people because they couldn't get along with other people, right? So, I mean, I think this is how we learn how to get along, how to function in groups, how to, I would offer, Stuart Brown has been a real mentor for me, and he wrote the book Play, and I'll talk a little more about his research in a second, but he was the one who first pointed out to me that when you think about play as this behavior that has lasted over, for eons, right? And the fact that play has survived evolution despite being a risky behavior, like that's a huge big deal. Like evolution does not favor behaviors that are risky unless they have some kind of real good payout. And I think the payout from play is that we learn how to function and get along as grown-ups. And you can see that in research around animals. Like there's all this amazing research around like wolf pups, and wolf pups, if they're not allowed to, as pups interacting with other pups, learn how to fake play fight and do all that stuff, and they can't function as part of a pack when they're older wolves. Like that it just doesn't work, right? And wolves have to function as a pack to survive, right? And I think we have to function as a pack to survive as well. And I would offer that this current moment, our social media, the way that leaders are behaving or not behaving, I would say that there's a certain play deficit that seems to be sort of surfacing in a lot of how people are treating one another. I also mentioned Stuart Brown, and this is a super extreme case, but Stuart initially got involved in doing research around play because he was studying people who'd been involved in really violent mass murders. There was the Texas Tech shooter, and he was looking into his personal psychological history. This guy who kind of went nuts and shot a bunch of people, and it turned out that he'd actually not been allowed to play at all as a kid. He'd had a very dominating father who'd prevented him from really interacting with other kids and playing at all. And so Stewart then did this pretty wild survey looking at people with a violent history and the prevalence of play deficit in for these people. It's pretty damning.
Wow. Um, I I guess to follow up on humans suffering or as a result of something lacking in play. I thought something was very interesting I read in your book, how you talked about very often in school we describe certain behavior as bad behavior, and if we kind of pick at the surface of this, it seems like this kid probably just wants some attention. You kind of posited that actually maybe it's for attention's sake, it's actually kind of a connection that they're looking for, and maybe that they're not getting it elsewhere. Um, I wonder, could you like unpack that a little bit, and then
Yeah,
do you see this? Um, do you see this play out with the kind of social media
yeah,
attention crazed
yeah.
culture we live in?
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really made that connection. I was super inspired by the work of Nadine Burke Harris. And Nadine was really one of the sort of doctors who initially brought a lot of attention to the concept of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and then trauma informed responses to how we educate people, but also like how we build the world to acknowledge that people have had these adverse experiences that affect their ability to really function. And she's she's now the Surgeon General for California, and she's just super inspiring. And she has a couple of books that are just she's amazing. Um, but I was really struck by she came out to visit the Playworks program once in action and said, you know, if you were designing a program that was built to be responsive to the needs of kids who've experienced a lot of trauma, it would look a lot like Playworks because um, we really go to extra length to make sure that kids have choice and voice in what's happening around them and what they're doing. That their expectations that we're super conscientious about how you handle transitions, which is where for people who've like if you're not feeling like in control of the world around you, transitions can be super ungluing, right? And so how do you actually like when we go into a transition with a group of kids, we're always like, okay, what we're going to do, just setting expectations and then narrating the transition as we get through it, and then calling out and delineating, okay, now we're out on the schoolyard. Now what we're going to do is this. And then you'll hear a signal. And when you hear the signal, you're going to stop, and then we'll transition back. Like doing it just very intentionally, right? And so with the trauma informed stuff and with kids and bad behaviors, what we kept seeing was that they were just kids who wanted attention, and that when like especially when we come into a playground and the principal would say, oh, there are these three kids, often boys, but not always, three kids who were just always getting in trouble. We would put them in charge of helping with the little kids, and like it was amazing the extent to which that almost immediately would like completely turn things around. Um, and and it's and I'm also super empathic about the grown-ups involved, because if you're out on a schoolyard or you're in a classroom and kids are not behaving in a cooperative way and they're being kind of disruptive or just kind of like icky, like, and it's okay as a mom to say that I think my kid's being icky. As a teacher, you're never supposed to say that they're being icky because they're kids, but they're humans and they can be icky, which doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means they're being icky. Anyway, it it doesn't bring out the best in grown-ups responding, right? And you feel threatened and they're questioning your authority, and everything about it is like just like built for a vicious negative cycle of ickiness. So and and stepping out of that and like being the human that's like, whew, we're gonna like let that go, and we're gonna hold on. Let me like, Jim, let me talk with you in a second. Let's get the rest of the kids learning, and then I'm gonna come back, and I got you, Jim. I'm like, I'm gonna see the best in you, no matter what you do. Like, there's a commitment there that, admittedly, if you're in charge of recess, you're in a much better position to get to make that commitment. If you're a classroom teacher and you're tasked with getting all these kids from point A to point B academically, it's hard to carve out the space to deal with the one kid who's kind of feeling unseen and unheard, and like they want to control the situation, even if that means bringing it down around them.
Hmm. I, w- I'm sure you're familiar that in Finland they they don't start school officially on,
Hmm.
and that before then they kind of have like supervised play. I wonder, would you like, does your gut want to say that potentially this is leading to a more um, community driven, um, better dialogue situation than other countries?
Well, I definitely think more play is better. Like I always joke when I mentioned I'm a mom, and people, because I like lead this national organization around people ask for parenting advice, and I'm always like, oh no, I offer no parenting advice because that will lead to my children becoming meth addicts almost inevitably. And I'm like, no, not going there. But I do often, like, if really pressed, I will say, yeah, I think in general you want to go with more sleep, more, water, and more play and less sugar. Those would be my like general parenting advices. They also happen to be my like how to be like a happier grown up advice too. So like they're not unrelated. So I think more play for little kids, for high school students, for college students, for grad students, and adults in the workplace, for senior. I think in general more play would be better. Like, so full stop. um, and I do think we often start things like academics, like the push to get kids reading earlier and earlier. There's so much to like question. Like, we do literacy before numeracy first here. Like, does that really make any sense? Like, so um, there's a lot of things about how education has been built, and it was built for the current state was built for an industrial society to create factory workers, right? At least in the West. Um, so I think uh, COVID's been obviously tragic in so many ways. I think there's some, my Pollyanna self can't help but hope that there are ways in which um, it raises questions about what actually works for kids and for families
Mm.
and for teachers and for educators more generally. So um, this is a moment where I think questioning it, like how we structure it, and we've always done that way, but the world has changed dramatically. So does that still really make that much sense? All of that said, in the US, every time someone says, well, in Finland they do this, there's a lot of eye rolling that happens. So I'm always, you have to like take that with a
Yeah,
grain of salt too.
yeah. But what's coming up here and you speaking after reading your book, it's kind of like we have such good intentions, right? We just want the kids to be able to read at an earlier age. We just want this, we just want that. And kind of like you were talking about how not too long ago we just wanted to create a society of work, of certain workers, and maybe we're kind of losing track of, or we haven't asked ourselves, like you said, after COVID, after this kind of massive pause for many people, to go, right, do we want to build a society where people can get really good at these tests and really good at, relaying information and these things, or do we want to build a society where people can communicate with each other and they can have fun, and there can be a leader, and it's not like the leader is this kind of egomaniac. The leader actually cares about other people in the community or in the tribe or in the team.
Yeah. No, I think that's the right question. And I think parenting young adults has been super, especially in this moment, right? Like it's been hard. Like in some ways, like I long for having parenting little kids where sort of it was hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Like, okay, I can deal with one of those, but and maybe it's not that different for young adults, but it feels more complex at least. And I at one point
Mm.
was saying to my daughter that I really wanted her to be happy, and she pushed back, like she wants, I think she wants some ease, and she wants to feel like she has agency in her life. But I think she felt almost not oppressed by like the sort of like the pressure to be happy felt like too much for her sometimes. And So I just have, like, I do think, I think when I, as a parent, when I think about what I want, which then like sort of leads directly to sort of how I think about schools and what we build to help other parents and other families find what they want for their kids. Um, I think I ultimately want our education system to be oriented towards helping kids find themselves and find the thing that gives their lives meaning and helps them establish connection with others, and um, ultimately uh, just sparks a love of learning.
Thanks for that. Before we move on to adults in play, there was a there was another a little quote that you had that I loved, and you said that play reminds us that it matters how it feels. I wonder if you could talk a little.
Yeah, I say that often, and I think, and actually, when you had mentioned you were going to ask me that question, and it was good because I'm like, oh, I should think about, you say things sometimes so many times, and like, oh, I haven't really thought about why I initially said that and what I meant. So I will step back. Defining play is one of those slightly weird things. It's not as obvious as, and there's sort of a spectrum of how people define play. I like the definition: any activity undertaken for no apparent purpose. But not everyone's totally comfortable with that. But I sort of like that. It has to be voluntary. Um, Often when you're doing it, you get lost in the sort of experience, and like it's sort of like Chicks at Me High's sort of sense of flow, that you're just kind of, it's all consuming in that way. Um, but so I think uh, so when you're doing something where it's not defined by the outcome, like it's not like driving to like Belfast and you're going to get there and then you've been successful. It's just like being in the car. um, then if you're not focused on an outcome, it does allow you to shift perspective to really focus on being in the present and paying attention to what is true in this present moment and what you're authentically experiencing right now. And so I think that when I say that play reminds us that it matters how it feels, you can do two identical things, but depending on how they feel, they're radically different activities. And I think being reminded of our intention and our attitudes and how we feel about the things we get to do and choose to do and have to do, um, that that is the difference between a life that feels like meaningful and engaging and one that can feel oppressive and disconnected from your values.
Do you think that we are somewhat separated from quote unquote how it feels as a society?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's so many ways in which um, we're set up to sort of numb out and not feel like, right, like, and like it was, I know, I love that this podcast really does have an emphasis on self-care and mental well-being, and I was thinking just in advance of having the conversation with you about the things I do to take care of my own mental well-being, and you started with the question, what's the crack, and like, and this may be, I remember that as being sort of a slogan from Guinness, but maybe that's not true. Like I felt like, and as a former rugby player, I like an occasional beer, but I'm also, one of the things I do to like take care of my own mental health is like check myself. Like, am I having a glass of red wine to transition from work to cooking dinner as a way to numb out? Or am I, like, and I just,
Mm,
we are a little bit set up that way, to
mm,
not, to power through and to, and just and in the U.S. we have this Horatio Alger myth about pulling ourselves up by the bootstrap, and you like persist, and I hold persistence as a personal value, and yet like I do try to remind myself to check myself. Am I persisting just to persist, and what am I actually feeling in this moment, and how might I stay present with that and make very intentional decisions about how to respond to the moment. And I will say too, like I opened the conversation by saying, you asked how I was, and I said, I'm worried about the Ukraine. Everything, we're set up to like not notice, like, right? Like, and I don't know about the news as much there in Northern Ireland, but like here, like it's in the news, but like it's right next to like what happened at the NBA All-Star game, or like, like, and so there's just like I feel like I want us to remember and pay attention to how it feels. And sometimes that's joyful and sometimes that's sorrowful. And they're both, they need each other to coexist.
I'm really glad you brought up that point about persisting. Or I saw something I read recently, and it says along the lines of, just because we can endure doesn't mean you have to endure.
Right.
And very recently, I quit doing jujitsu, which is a sport that from the outside I loved to watch. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna do it. And then I signed up to it, and it just didn't quite fill the cup the way I wanted to. But because I'd signed up, I put my name down. I pay my monthly thing. It comes out every month. I didn't want to feel like we have this stigma with quitting, don't we? In
Mm-hmm.
our culture, where it's just like I didn't want to feel like a quitter. But then every time I'd have to leave the house to go to jiu-jitsu, I was like, oh, I'm dreading it. And it wasn't one of, I'm getting back into my running now, and people say, oh yeah, you'll dread running for the first 2 weeks, it's horrible. But then once you get fit again, you'll really get that runner's high and you'll start to love it again.
Mm-hmm.
And I never got that from jiu-jitsu. I never came back
Yeah.
home and was like, I'm really glad I went to that lesson. I just came back going, I'm glad I didn't quit, like a
Yeah.
pride thing. But I never was like, oh, that was really good. I'm really happy I went. And so I eventually was like, what am I doing? Like you said, I had to check myself, and I was like,
Yeah.
who am I trying to prove? I'm trying to prove it to myself. So what I'm gonna do get to black belt just to prove that like I'm not a quitter. Like it's just a ridiculous premise.
Yeah. And I actually think, quitting, learning when to quit, learning how to say no, like
Yeah.
those are among the most valuable things. And like, and Seth Godin is a business sort of guru in the US, and he writes, and he has this great thing about, he compares, there's the cul-de-sac and the dip, and or the dead end and the dip. And he said that the thing about quitting is that when you're in a cul-de-sac, when you're in a dead end, like quitting is the absolute right thing to do. But but you have to learn to discern, like, are you just in a dip?
Yeah.
In which case, like, if you persist a little, it's going to get better. Like, and
Yeah.
I think that's one of the gifts of
Mm.
wisdom and maturing, and like just making your way through, that becomes more and more clear. But I think the well executed quit is a powerful, wonderful,
Yeah.
good thing.
For sure. For sure. Cut your
We
losses while
want to
you can.
destigmatize the well-executed quit.
I wanted to bring this conversation forward. Jim mentioned obviously that you've done work as well in adult play, and to some people that might sound almost on. Like, how do those two things coincide? Obviously, we understand what play means in an infant sense, in a child sense. We've all gone through it at some stage, or at least we've seen others go through it if you haven't been allowed to by your parents. But even I'll be honest myself. Even myself, I don't really understand play in terms of, the adult world, just because I think maybe a lot of us might conflate it with sport, doing sport and maintaining sports. But like you said, I like your definition of play, where it's something voluntary and there's sometimes it's to no end. And
Yeah.
sport doesn't fall into that category, because you are trying to beat someone, or you're trying to score points, or if you're running, you're trying to get fit, whatever it may be. So I don't think, whilst there may be kind of parallel, I don't think they kind of are the same thing. So what in your mind, what does play mean in the adult world?
Yeah, well, so I think, again, it's an activity undertaken for no apparent purpose, and I think the apparent is the key sort of thing. So I've done a lot of sort of corporate trainings, and work where play can be something as basic as, like, when you start a meeting, you start it with a sort of check-in question, which invites everyone to show up in their three-dimensional full selves, and like, so one of my favorite check-in question was, what was the first concert you ever attended? And doing that at the beginning of a finance committee meeting can feel like, people are like, what? But I've like, in fact, and one of the examples I use is, like, I was doing a training with a school board. It's the parent group that's sort
Hmm.
of the governing body, right? And it was known that there were these two school board members who really could not stand one another. And when we did the check-in question, what was the first concert you attended? They went around and they introduced themselves. And these two people who really disdain like oozed towards each other, they both, Earth, Wind, and Fire had both been their first concert. And there was this moment where like you could just see like suddenly this person that this other person had like hated was just a little more of a three-dimensional human with something in common that just, I mean, they didn't like go off into the sunset holding hands. It wasn't a dramatic, like, I don't mean to like oversell this, but just that slight moment of consciousness that like, oh, I might have something in common with you. That's an example, a very light example of adults playing, right? We talk a lot about, there's a lot around team building and icebreakers, and they can be done in ways just like you can get kids to play together where kids don't feel like they have a lot of agency, or they didn't choose the games. I think there are ways to introduce play in ways that help build trust and rapport among grown-ups, help them get to know each other, help them just do activities that bring a little light and levity to work situations that can be kind of intense. And then through nonverbal communications, the stuff that I was talking about at the very beginning, that when I was a kid, I found so reassuring as a way to feel seen and connected to others. Introducing those kinds of activities into the workplace, or any other kind of association where grown-ups have to figure out how to collaboratively get from point A to point B. That's kind of what I'm talking about by adult play. The one other thing I would say too is that you were saying how the concept of adult play feels like, oh, I mean, I'll tell you, in America, you look at who gets to play as grown-ups, often white men, like off playing golf. Like there's a certain, if you look at who gets to play, there's often a fairly good map of who has power.
That's interesting. I was thinking, do you find when you like the thing with like adulthood, which I struggle to call myself an adult, but I mean, I guess maybe by numerical value, I'm kind of
I like grown up. I like grown up
yeah.
better than that.
Even that sounds but I guess I'm technically an adult by governmental standards, but like it seems to me that just being an adult just means having more and more responsibilities. And like, when I look to my parents and stuff, it just seems like it's just like a cumulative amount of responsibilities as the years go on. When you get kids and so on, you get a mortgage and blah blah blah. And I wonder, do you ever find when talking to adults if there's a certain almost intrinsic or inbuilt guilt in playing or in taking the time out to to play or to indulge in an activity which you can't really by any metric or by any standard metric be like, oh, that's very beneficial, like for example, because I think a lot of people, a lot of adults, they look after their kids, they do the best they can for their kids, they have a very hectic job, and then if they can, they'll try and squeeze in a gym session, right?
Right.
And then it's like, but they just don't have any more bandwidth or time, and they might feel and even if they did have time, feel guilty to be like, I used to love painting, and you know what, or I used to love pottery or whatever, and like I'm gonna go back into that, but then they feel like maybe by doing that, they're neglecting a certain responsibility that they have to, quote unquote, achieve, fulfill as the responsible adult that we're all expected to be.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, definitely. Like, definitely feel like often people just feel like I don't have time. Um, and I will push back on that. I will like say, well, how much television did you watch this week? Or like, how much time did you spend on social media? Like, on some level, I lead with empathy. Yes, we all feel completely overwhelmed. And I would be also like, and nobody's going to take care of you other than you at this point. As a grown up, that's one of the real bummers, is there's nobody designated necessarily to take care of you except yourself. So I'm like a little tough love on that. So yes, I definitely hear that, and often, especially for folks who are working multiple jobs, and just like that is totally justified. And there's no, I don't mean to guilt anyone who like legitimately doesn't have the time. Like that is real for a lot of people. So that is true. And we make choices, and I think making good choices can really um, make a difference. For the super busy work people um, who like, I'm too busy at work. I work 14-hour days. Like, I think that's just, I flat out just disagree. And I think, I don't know if it's Kahneman and Tversky who wrote Going Slow to Go Fast, that whole thing. I think it's Tversky who, won the Nobel Prize and is famous for sort of saying something to the effect of, years have been lost because of the unwillingness to lose hours. And there's a lot of research that suggests that actual creativity is is really fostered and nourished by being somewhat underemployed. That being busy, busy, busy is actually not a spark for innovation. Um,
Mm.
all of that set aside, too, I will just tell you from you all could be my kids, like as far as age wise. At 57, what I've found from both my peers as well as friends who are older than I am, you also don't feel that different when you're, I mean, I feel like, I hate to tell you this because like everybody keeps hoping that like you're going to pass through some magic portal and suddenly feel like a grown up, and
Yeah.
like I don't feel that different than I did when I was 12. And so yeah, I have a mortgage. I have humans that I'm responsible for making sure that their college tuition is paid for. I have employees. I have those things, and yet I still basically feel a lot like I did when I was the crossing guard in sixth grade, making sure that I could put on my orange neon thing and help people cross the street. It just um, I just it doesn't change as much as you might hope from your vantage point at 26. I'm sorry.
Mm.
Thank you. I think that realization might come in handy. But also, I think there's also a broader point there, maybe that, like, you said you feel like you're very similar to your 12-year-old self. Maybe there's a thing of not to drown out that inner child, not to
Yeah.
drown out that, yearning for creativity or yearning for playtime, which as a child is just completely normal, and no loving parent or adult would. No, you cannot do that. That is wrong to want to play. But yet, when we turn into adulthood, it becomes this thing of like, again, like silly, and we fetishize this thing of like having 3 hours sleep and working 21 hours. This nonsense that you hear that we're obviously trying to like renege and go back on. But like, it is this massive, especially at our age, it's like, oh, you have to work through your 20s, smash
Yeah.
it out, and then by the time you're 30, you'll be a billionaire and you can just forget about it all. But it's like this weird thing where we fetishize not taking care of ourselves as
Yeah.
like a kind of way of like monitoring our success. And anyone who maybe does take a step back, who does like chill out, I live in Spain, I've moved to Spain. If you talk to the British about how they see the Spaniards, they see them as like these lazy good for nothings. You
Hmm.
talk about like the Spaniards, how they see the British, they're like, these guys just work till they die and then they don't have any time to enjoy it. So what's the point? I'm just gonna sit here in the sun and have a nice beer with my mates, and I'll enjoy the time that I've got, and it's like this weird dichotomy of how we
Yeah.
see the world.
I would say too, and you bring up sleep and how like I think it's really interesting. Like I always feel like that's always a red. If you hear, it's a red flag. If you hear people saying, "Oh, we don't need sleep, we don't need play," the science of sleep and the science of play have some really interesting parallels as these sort of very essential, sort of alternative states of consciousness that actually I think contribute to our kind of wakeful consciousness in the real world, kind of. And I think I just love the thinking about the parallels between sleep and play and its importance to us as humans.
I got really into researching sleep, and it has just kind of changed changed a lot how I look at it, how I consider it, and I notice it now, or like almost now when I'm around people, I just go, do you get enough sleep? I can really kind of
Yeah.
feel it in the room, right?
You can totally see it with kids in school too. Like you can tell which kids didn't get enough sleep and how and like the relationship with like having breakfast and like all those things and like and then it's as far as physical health, not getting enough sleep and its connection to obesity and not it's what the whole like we are one whole system and like we treat it as these very siloed parts and it's so destructive to our well-being. I will say it's been an interesting like having my youngest son is a senior in high school, and so for the last couple of years of dealing with high school, he's been doing it in this virtual world, and he got to sleep in, and he was just he's growing a lot, and like the other kids when they had to go off to high school early in the morning and they were just dragging and like they hated it, and like nothing about how high school was set up seemed designed at all for their biological clocks. Anders is like in COVID thrived, at least from a like how his sleep and the patterns of when he needs to pay attention and getting to do some of his schoolwork asynchronously. It was interesting to watch. Like obviously not perfect. It would have been better for him, I think, to be in school with his mates, you know. But that said, it was the schedule part was like, ooh.
Yeah. The school timetable is dictated a lot more by the average adult's
Yeah,
starting time than whether the kids can get enough sleep and
yeah,
breakfast before they go.
yeah,
But so I have to admit that the reason why I came across your work was about 2 months ago. I was chatting with my mate, and Earl, and he lives with his partner, and he said to me, he said, "Hey, like, man, I'm just having a fun deficiency here. You know, there's just not a lot of fun." And it really got me thinking because he's quite a deep thinker, and for him to say that made me think, yeah, there's a lot just having fun. And then I got thinking, like, in the society that we live in, particularly besides drinking alcohol, when can we have fun? Like, I don't think I mean, maybe I have, but I can't recall a time where I had adults like quite excited saying, "Yeah, it was just so much fun," and it was like during the day, and there was no drink involved, there was no drugs involved. It was just, yeah, we just had
yeah,
loads of fun, you know. And
yeah.
I just think, what would it look like if we had that, you know?
Yeah. I think it's I love the question, and I think it's and it makes me think like, and I also, for me it overlaps, like for me being outside is a little bit of that, like that kind of connection to like awe and marvel and like, oh my god, we live in this beautiful place, and like there's a joyfulness and a sort of a quality of like elation and delight. Like I think like and sometimes going after fun feels a little like um I like delight too. And I
Okay.
think you can find delight in art museums and at a concert, and like, you know, delight's an interesting one. It's a spark. Um, but I think it is that, like, when you describe fun and the way you're describing, like, oh, it was so much fun. Like, what does it mean to be like really alive and really
Mm,
present and like, and just like overwhelmed with like gratitude for an experience, right? And I just
mm,
and I think, you know, we're a complicated mammal, right? And I think different humans find it in different ways. Like for some people it's travel. Like you know, I'm a giant basketball fan. I was recently, you know, at the Golden State Warriors are my local team that I care desperately about, and like I was at a game, and like everybody's masked, and you know, and Clay Thompson, who was a player who'd been out injured for 2 years, came back, and like, and we're like this incredibly diverse group of humans mixed in age and race and size and gender and all these different, all the various isms and things. And Clay walks onto the court, and the crowd goes nuts in this shared moment of joy for this man who had persisted over 2 years, and in a good way persisted, right? um, and had come back, and like people were crying, and like seriously it was like, and like and it was like, when you like, it was so much fun to be there, and it was moving and it was inspiring, and I was part of something bigger than myself. And
mm,
Clay must, I mean, he must have been that must, what a weird experience to be like this guy, right? Like that he had created this moment for all of these tens of thousands of people. Anyway, I think those opportunities exist, but it almost brings us full circle to back to where we were starting about the importance of the small acts. Like you have to
yeah.
show up, to you have to be willing to like go do something. Like I don't think that kind of joy, that so much fun happens like checking your Twitter feed. I think it can happen playing kind of cool Minecraft games. I think people get derived real. I'm not gonna be the. I don't. I think video games can be super fun and playful, and I think multiplayer games are it's kind of amazing, and the technology is cool, and like I think I am a big fan of analog real time human interaction. I like, but like this conversation with you, like totally enjoyable. New humans I've never met before, having a conversation. Like, how lucky are we? Um,
Mm,
I think it's saying yes and seeing open doors and being willing to walk through them and try new things, but to show up and be present. And I think, um, and it's been hard with the pandemic, right? Like everything about the pandemics, like sort of orient us towards saying no. Like I shouldn't go do that. I shouldn't go. I don't want to get. I don't want to be exposed and potentially get somebody else sick. Like it makes it hard to understand the risks, and it does sort of close us off from one another. But that's hopefully going to change, and is changing already, and maybe
mhm.
it'll make us appreciate it more.
I was just thinking as well, as you were talking there, and we just previously had spoken about kind of the schedules of high schools, for example. I'm wondering as well, and this is I've just thought about this now, so forgive me if this is an undercooked idea, but I was thinking like the difference between kids and adults when it comes to play or fun is that kids, all being well, if they're in a great environment and stuff, kind of get it on the daily. You know, you've got, like you said, you have break time throughout school, and then as long as you do your homework or whatever, at least back in the day, you're allowed to, like I said, go out into the estate, whether it was play football, build a den, whatever it was, and that would be as well Monday to Friday. Then obviously you have your weekends as well. Whereas I feel like just thinking now how most adults spend their time is like, right, Monday to Friday is just let's endure, let's get through the week, and then Saturday and Sunday maybe we can start to think about should we go to the cinema or should we go to an art museum. And I think maybe this might be a benefit of COVID with people working from home, that they can manage their time better. Is that like if we could try to exploit the week a bit more and not just kind of dedicate 2 days of every seven to fun time or to relaxation time, because by that time as well you might be so knackered if you've got a big family and a lot of responsibilities that trying to do something fun is just like, I just need to recharge the batteries here. Whereas like
Mm.
maybe if we could try to, and I've tried to do it since COVID's happened, like really make the evenings my own, whether that's playing football with my mates or like doing something rather than just coming back and, like you said, going on social media or turning on the TV and just zoning out until the next day where I just have to wake back up and go back into work and do it all over again. And I wonder if that's come across in your research, or if you found that like where people try to implement it throughout the week rather and stagger it maybe rather than have it like really concentrated in just 1 or 2 days.
Yeah, for sure. No, and I think the research that I think is most relevant to that question is around habit, and we are creatures of habit, right? And like, and you brought up sleep. Like, you have to intentionally design rituals to sort of, help with sleep, and that. And I think one of the things about play, right, is play is kind of one of the ways we learn to deal with rituals and rules and referees, and so creating rituals that you bake into your week that promote play, and like that's how you do it. But you have to be intentional. It has to be designed as part of your life. And what I think what people find is when you actually take agency about how your time when you can, right, again acknowledging that for some people economics makes this actually almost impossible. But for those of us who can, right, if you have that level of privilege, um, designing a life where play is infused more generally, um, it has these sort of, it creates a virtuous cycle where you are more present and more effective in your work relationships, in parenting. You have fewer conflicts. You have the bandwidth and the resilience to address challenges when they arise. It is the difference between a virtuous and a vicious cycle, I think.
Jill, Jill, I also think we've succeeded in coming full circle in the sense of talking about awareness as well. Like you mentioned being at the basketball game or this conversation that we're having right now and how enjoyable it is and how lucky it is that we can have this. And I couldn't help but think that so often people are so plugged into the next thing that they have to do, and then tomorrow morning I have this presentation, or then I have to have this deadline, or then I have to collect the kids, and that we can never almost like people feel like, oh, I can't actually just check in here and then just kind of look around and just feel how I feel right now. Um, and and I would, I mean, this is just the lens that I see it through. Like you were saying, how if someone can expose themselves to some fun throughout the week, that all of a sudden other things aren't so. Um, and it just reminded me about meditation as well, where it's like if you can meditate for like a certain time through the day, you're never too far away from that moment where you kind of had like a sense, like a deeper sense of you, right? And when you're playing, when you're having fun, you also have this kind of like kind of consuming sense of presence, right?
Yeah.
And
No, I
can
often,
be.
I totally, I talk about this like often when I'll give a talk, I'll start the talk off by playing a quick sort of silly, pointless game. But I do it to point out that when you're playing this game, you're not actually thinking about your grocery list or, oh, I have to remember to pick the kids up at 5, or like play is like it's incredibly all consuming, even the most pointless silly games. But I'll tell you, like I used to think when I just like playing basketball, you set a pick and then you're rolling, you're not thinking about like literally that's consuming in a way that is. So I actually I meditate every morning for like 20 minutes, and I often have laughed that I'm far less present when I'm meditating and sitting on the cushion. Like my brain goes pinging all over the place. Sometimes I have 14 or 15 full consecutive seconds of actually being present, but largely my brain is pinging. Whereas when I'm playing a game, I really like have sort of large swaths of time where I am thinking about nothing but what is happening in that present moment. And
Mm.
I think I'm better at playing than I am at meditating, but it's we're all on our own personal paths.
It brings to mind we have a recurring guest, one the guru that of the podcast, called him Adam Starr, and I said something very similar. I was like, I can't. I just feel like I can't meditate. It's like the minute I sit down is that's when all the voices start coming to me. But I was saying like you, like I love playing football, and when I'm playing football, I don't even know my own name. I'm just like playing the game. Do you know what I
Right.
mean? And then at the end of
Yeah.
it, then we can. And he was like, that is to him. He was saying like he's a Buddhist, and he was saying he was like that's still meditation in a way. It's just that we like to think of it in the Western world of like you said, you sit down on a cushion for 20 minutes. You might have the Calm app on or something like that, trying to help you through, and that's fine. He's like that's one way, and maybe that's the most traditional way. But he was saying that like whatever it is, if it's cooking for you, that is all consuming, where you're just in that moment, nothing else is around you, that is meditation of a sort, right? And that really opened my eyes because it just made me feel like basically less of a shit. I was like, how is everyone meditating? I've got a mental health podcast and I can't even sit down for 2 goddamn minutes to meditate. And then when he told me that, I was like, listen, if Kadam Adam Star says that to me, I'm good to go with that. So I'll take that to the bank. So
Okay.
for anyone out there who's
Just,
listening who shares, then yeah.
just for clarification, he use it as an excuse not to try
He didn't.
meditation.
I took it that way. I took it that way.
No, as anyone who knows me knows, I'm a big fan of quotes. And just what you were speaking about, Jill, the quote that came up this week: meditate to become better meditators. We meditate to be more awake during our lives. And that's almost exactly how you described it, where you're like, at the time I'm struggling and there's thoughts coming left, right, and center. But then when I'm actually with my kids or I'm actually doing this, I do feel a bit more present. And I thought that
Yeah.
was nice. Um, sorry, Jill, I'm very conscious of your time. I know you're a busy woman. For people who are super busy, and like you said, when you're busy, almost creativity is kind of prevented or blocked in some way, and people are listening saying like, hey, I like this idea of play, but I can't even think of, okay, what would I like, how do I have fun with my girlfriend, or how do I play with my girlfriend, or me and my friends, like me and my work colleagues, what could we do? Is there a nice example where you've seen, or like, oh, okay, if I've seen this happen before and this has worked really effectively for adults?
Yeah. Well, so it's a sort of nerdy, unsexy answer to the question, but like I'm like, you gotta schedule it, like, right? So I am like, I have a pretty very sort of, I'm very committed to my morning routine. Not everybody's a morning person, but like I get up in the morning before everybody else in my household is up. I have my coffee and then I meditate. Like I just want to go on. There's nothing really sort of virtuous about my meditating because it requires caffeine. Um, I then I write for an hour every day because I'm a writer, but it's for me it's a very creative process. Every day I have 15 minutes where I make time to draw. I'm terrible. I totally enjoy it. I so and then I sketch. I'm pretty good about scheduling like when I have a meeting with someone I haven't met before, if it's going to be in person, I often will suggest that we do the meeting as a walk. Um, so I get outside and like I just there are ways in which I just prioritize seeing people. And you know, my kids are older now, so like this was harder when I had, you know, I had to like make sure that I was the one making dinner for everybody every night. But like as it as it as it as you sort of schedule your days, what are the rituals you can build in that normalize and routinize play being infused? And you don't have to like, it doesn't have to be a long time. Like recess is actually a great um, parallel, right? Like recess is 15 minutes, right, in the school day. It's not like, and it makes a world of difference, especially, you know, especially if you're going to be on like Zoom for hours every day, baking in, scheduling in time, putting it in your calendar. Um, but going outside for me, like I think that would be what I would recommend to people. But you have to do it. There's not like some like magic pill you can take. You gotta make it your priority.
Thanks, Rachel. Seb, do you have any more questions before we ask the final one?
No, I was just gonna say that maybe the final one feels slightly null and void,
Yeah.
in just that the final one is how do you take care of your mental health, and I feel like throughout this podcast you've kind of alluded to it, but maybe we'll ask the question anyway, just in case there are any tips and tricks that you haven't alluded to that maybe someone could incorporate
Well,
into their own schedules.
the one thing I wanted to say, which isn't a direct answer to it, but I just it's over the years been super important to me that like I've you know I've had lots of young people come to work at Playworks or Mocha or Substan, and like it was their first job, and um, as a leader, I've felt like one of the key things was to talk about my own family. Like my father struggled with depression. My uncle struggled with depression and took his life. I've had other family members have issues with um, OCD. Just like mental health is like real and present and everybody's families, and we never talk about it. And so I've always felt like as a leader and as someone, especially who works with younger people who either might have their own experiences with mental health issues or a family member or a loved, you know, or a partner. Um, I can't tell you the number of times where like someone would come to me and there'd be like a level of shame or worry in talking about mental health, and I would like come out basically as someone who like mental health issues have had an impact on my life. And so um, so I really appreciate that you all have this podcast and you're talking about it. And I just think it's a health issue. Like we are human beings in these bodies. And like, so anyway, I just wanted to say that first. And so I think like one of the key things like about like dealing with your mental health every day is like acknowledging that we have mental health. Like we mental well-being is real, just like physical well-being, um and our bodies and our hearts and our minds need our care and attention and nurturing to thrive. And so you, if you try and pretend it's not there, you're doing yourself ultimately a massive disservice, and more, and maybe more importantly, you're doing a massive disservice to the people who love you. And so so I guess the first thing is like in terms of just what do I do to take care of my mental health is I acknowledge I have one. And so and I so I guess that would be
That
what I
always
would say.
helps.
Yes.
Great stuff. Well, that
Well,
that was great. Great advice. And there's definitely enough people, myself before probably a couple of years ago, who would deny that we suffered with anything, because that wasn't the scene thing to do. Just like you said, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get on with it. So, tough, stiff British upper lip and all that type of nonsense, and then things get like one of our favorite words, which we've stolen from America, is squirrely, and we've realised that when you start doing things like that, it gets squirrely very quickly. So yeah, no, it's great advice. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, Joe.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a million.